Welcome to the Awaken Empowered podcast. I'm Micheila Sheldan, and I'm here with Ethan Fox. And we thought we'd dedicate an entire episode to entity attachments and dark energies, which is a topic that we've been discussing and also has been coming up a lot in the movement and especially in some of my groups. And I think Ethan and I have a really different and an interesting approach to understanding this whole mystical world of entities and beings that we know are real and we have to deal with here on planet Earth, but I think needs to be simplified and sometimes brought down to earth. But I want to begin just by sharing some of our personal experiences and perspectives on these beings. And Ethan, you do energy transfers, as I know many of you out there know. So maybe you can start by sharing some of the interesting experiences that you've had with entity attachments and some of the things that you've come to know about that.
Well, in the context of energy transfers, even going well beyond that, because I've only been officially doing that for the last, I don't know, maybe 9 years or so, in a more public way. Although I have a lot of life experience in this particular area. I know a lot of people, and I know this is what you want to touch on today. A lot of people have the belief that we should protect ourselves or put bubbles around ourselves or any number of different visualizations, and we've sort of come to the understanding that all of those ideas are really more fear-based. And now, being somebody who does these energy transfers and who intends for people to send their attachments and dense energy all throughout the day and night, if that was something that was a problem for me, then I would never get any rest, because there would constantly be all this very negative or turbulent things taking place around me, because I don't do anything to protect myself in the type of ideas that most people have in this context. So my perspective on this, and we'll explore this further, which is the vibration that you maintain determines what affects you in terms of entities from other dimensions. For example, in this space that we're sitting in now, there are all kinds of different dimensional realities that are interacting and different beings in each of them. And if I were to raise or lower my vibration, I would come into attunement with them, sort of like using a radio tuner, which I know nobody probably even knows what that is, but a lot of those of you watching this show may be old enough to know what a radio tuner is. And in a radio tuner, it's just a dial that you turn to adjust the frequency of the radio receiver so that it's receiving information from any number of different frequencies. So now the radio is surrounded by all the different frequencies at all times. So if you have a number of radio stations, for example, in your area, all of them are broadcasting simultaneously, but the radio can only hear the frequency that it's dialed into. And even though all the other ones are there, and so this is what's happening with us living in this physical dimension, while having all of these other dimensional realities and all the entities and beings and energies and all these other dimensions also coexisting in the same space. It's the tuner, using the radio tuner example, it's a radio tuner within our vibrational being or our consciousness that interacts with each of those dimensions. So putting a bubble around yourself would be sort of like putting the radio inside a Faraday cage and blocking everything out. It doesn't really work very well. But the better way to do it is to adjust your frequency so that you are existing in a space in alignment or in attunement with the frequencies you want to interact with. So for example, people who are mediums tend to speak to your relatives who have passed on, or people who have passed on from a very physical incarnation, and you have to attune yourself to a very specific range of frequencies to communicate with beings of that nature. And the same is true or for if you're a channel like Micheila is. Micheila, in order to speak to the Pleiadians, has to be attuned to a certain frequency range that the Pleiadians are interacting with or communicating with, because they don't directly interact with this physical dimension. If they did, then they would be physical and would appear right next to me in this room. So over the years, and prior to energy transfers in my younger life, I knew a lot of people who were very spiritually gifted in different ways, and some of them who were really struggling with these issues. I'll give you a good story example from my distant past. I would say I was around maybe 20 to 25 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood, and or mid 20s. I met a friend at that time who she could see the people who had passed on, all and even animals who had died or had left the physical reality. She could see them everywhere, and she couldn't turn it off. It was something that was always on. And so if we were standing in front of her, she would see past relatives of ours standing behind us and sometimes saying things that they want us to know. She could be driving down the road and she would see a cat crossing the road, and she'd stop for the cat because to her, there was such the two dimensions or the two frequencies of this space where the spirit or the energy of that cat who had actually been hit by a car in that intersection, where that was existing, and the physical reality were blending for her. And so she couldn't visibly see the difference between a cat that was physically real and a cat that had passed away and had no physical substance to it anymore. So she told me a story about how she was driving down the road and she would stop at this intersection every time, and when her friend was in the car with her, there was nothing in the intersection. Her friend didn't see anything, and so her friend eventually asked her, well, why do you keep stopping here? There's no stop sign, there's no traffic light. And she said, well, I'm waiting for the cat to cross the road. But what they found out was there's actually no cat physically there. But because she was so tuned into the frequency range of beings that had passed on, and it was something that she didn't know how to manipulate or to adjust, it was always there. And so one of the problems we had to deal with early on was she couldn't sleep at night because when she tried to sleep at night, all of these beings were everywhere in her room, and they were standing on her bed and she, doing all kinds of things that she couldn't rest. And so now this was a long time ago, before I was aware of what I was doing, but at least I knew enough that I could try to do something. And so I went into her apartment and I just simply raised the frequency of the apartment. Now, she had been dealing with this problem for as far back as she could remember. And after I left there, the problem went away for about 2 weeks. And then slowly it started coming in again, where a few beings showed up and a few beings showed up. And eventually she went right back to where she was before, where all these entities were walking around her apartment and bothering her at night. And the problem was, or the solution, or at least what we can learn from this, is by changing the frequency of the space, I was able to make it so that these entities couldn't coexist in that space with her. So when she was home for a couple of weeks, nothing bothered her. But then as time went on, what I did was slowly overwritten or returned back to her own energy field. And so eventually the beings were there again. So in that example, we can see protection wasn't the solution, but rather raising your frequency to a level where you're interacting with the kind of things that you want to interact with is the solution. So if you want to be a medium, then maybe a gift like she has is great, and but it might be helpful to turn it off once in a while when you don't want to be bothered or when you want to sleep at night. So in that sense, that's just one of the many stories that I would illustrate. I mean, I've had many friends from the past, distant past even, who had very physical interactions, even with beings who had passed on, and some of them were very hostile interactions. And these are situations where I would get involved to help to raise their frequency or vibration or the environment that they were in. And in every case, it solved the problem. But sometimes the problem resumed because that person hadn't learned how to maintain that frequency on their own, even though the environment might have held that for a little while. So that's some of my experiences in that area. So is that what you're getting at as far as?
Yeah, well, you opened up a huge Pandora's box here. I think of a lot of different points and topics, we could address. But what I notice in the spiritual community is there is a level of complexity when it comes to understanding and sorting through all of these various negative entities and beings. And of course, we have all the history and all the stories of where they come from and why they're here and how they want to siphon humans' energy. And I truly believe in all of that stuff. So I want to give a little bit about background about me and my perspective and how I've learned to deal with that as well. And what's interesting about my path is when I began channeling, I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about metaphysics. I was not in this world at all. So I was really just kind of exploring and finding my way. And exactly what you're saying about navigating frequency is something I learned to do in a really subtle sense. Because when you're awakening and you're raising your consciousness, all of those beings and all of those dimensions are naturally going to become accessible to you. So I don't think that we necessarily are always interacting with negative entities or beings because we've done something wrong or our vibration is low. Certainly that's the case when we're being bothered. Okay, so I notice in my channeling work, sometimes when I'm preparing for an incoming client, I can find a negative being or an entity in the energy around them, guaranteed, but it's not who we want to speak to. And it's not always a being or entity that's significantly impacting their journey. So we just resonate higher, we resonate higher. But I had many circumstances early on where certain entities were speaking to me about things that I just knew were not of a level of importance or were trustworthy. And in hearing those messages, I would just vibrate higher and basically become very nonchalant and ignore them. And my guides very early on were quick to abolish the whole protection model, which I know is extremely controversial because many of us are taught to bubble ourselves in light. But the guides I work with told me that this was like an affirmation that something was more powerful than me. So the second you state a prayer of protection, you're actually affirming your weakness and that something else has power over you. It's better to continue to raise your vibration and state really positive intentions. And so I learned to cultivate this practice where I was stating positive intentions for connecting to direct myself to the energies that were best for me or for others, whoever I was channeling for, or even the entire world for that matter. But I do want to acknowledge that these entities are real and they can be physically disturbing and real. Because I did have an experience very early on when I was channeling where I became very ill. And I spent an afternoon in the emergency room at the hospital. And it was a really miserable day to be, there's never a good day to be in the emergency room, but it was just a particularly busy and traumatic day to be in the emergency room. And I was forgotten about. I had to wait a really long time. I just happened to be by myself. No one could go with me. And I got home and I was fine the next day. I got my treatment, whatever I needed, but I could feel this sense of heaviness in my auric field. And it was so unnatural to me. And I went to bed that night and kept seeing a face, kind of staring at me, and it would shake me awake. And I knew something was up. But again, this was not really my area of expertise, nor was I, experienced in dealing with these types of situations. At the time, my kids were very young. I put them on the bus to go to school. My husband at the time went to work. and I went to take a shower, and I closed the door. The dog was in the bathroom with me, and I heard this incredible crash. And I thought someone broken in the house. And I walked out of the bathroom, and lo and behold, I had a glass table with wrought iron legs, and the glass on the table had been lifted and turned and was inside of the wrought iron, and everything on the table had been shattered and thrown across the room. Of course, there was no one in the house, so I knew, this obviously had to be this thing, this being or entity or this heaviness that I felt. And I don't advise this. However, I decided to channel it with no fear, just sheer determination to understand why it was following me home and what it wanted and how I could remove it. And what I found was it was a lost soul. It was a man who had perished in a fire along with his family and was looking for help, desperately stuck between worlds and looking for help. So I never discount this idea of negative entities or energies, and even going beyond that realm of spirit that passes on. We know we're dealing with the, archons and reptilians, and one of my huge awakenings to what we now talk about as reptilian consciousness came during a channeling that I did for the organization. And some of you out there who are new, who found this podcast, may not know that Ethann and I are co-directors or work together on Flower of Life's Institute. And it's an organization focused on human consciousness. And we were working at the time on all these various issues that were going on the planet that we're still kind of dealing with today, like chemtrails and fluoride in the water. And we were at a standstill, and I decided to channel about it one day, and just to get some insight as to what direction, as a group, as a collective, we should go. And the guides told me that day, until everyone on the planet understood that there was a dark consciousness that was overseeing all of these various physical things, we would never be able to overcome it. And that was extremely profound and a huge turning point for me, because I had never heard of reptilians before. I immediately started channeling more about them, and some of you who read the book and follow my work now, they come up quite a bit. So the question is, what do we do about it? And I think there's a lot of different paths and avenues that we can take today when we're having to look at and deal with this stuff. But unfortunately, I think that spiritual protection isn't probably the best and most effective route.
You have a lot of interesting stories in this particular subject area, and so many different directions we can go. Because interestingly, when I look over my life, although I primarily lived a very mainstream life prior to the past decade, I had a lot of very unusual friends who were very spiritually talented. Some not on purpose, they just were born with certain abilities that they just came to know later on. And for probably because the nature of whatever you're vibrating out to the universe is what you draw in for your experience. So I unknowingly didn't realize that I had a very spiritually oriented path ahead of me in my life. And as a result, I was bringing in a lot of very talented people in these different areas, or people who just had experiences in of these that you might categorize as paranormal experiences or extraterrestrial contact experiences or things like that, long before I even fully comprehended what those things really were. And so I've known a lot of people who have had even what is mainstream categorized as poltergeist kind of experiences, where it was very physical, like you described, the table shattering. I knew somebody in my early 20s who had some sort of an entity attachment to where she would wake up at night and something would be pushing down on her chest and she couldn't breathe. And she was even thrown out of her second-story building a couple times by this entity. It was so physicalized for her. And I think, so, you may have any range of experiences. I've had people over the last decade who have come to me with different kinds of attachment issues or whether it be reptilian or some other kind of lower vibrational entity. And in many instances, the problem was resolved in the energy transfer itself to where it was never an issue again. But the issue, I think, is where some people, their own vibration isn't yet maintaining that level. So where one energy transfer may solve the problem for one person and another person it may not, it's because that individual has to take on the intention to continually raise their frequency. And now that could be a variety of things, I think, because I'm generally a pretty happy person, and I think that's not the reason why my vibration may be high enough to where people can send entities to me and it has no impact on me personally. But I think it's more a side effect of it. When your vibration is higher, you tend to be a more optimistic person. You tend to be drawn to more positive experiences in life, and you're not drawn to a lot of the more density attracting things in society. For example, we were just talking about how it was the Grammys the other day, right? They've always been very satanic, but because of the last few years in the world, all of these individuals in the world who have been practicing satanic religions are coming out into the open. And so now you can see it very obviously in Hollywood and different celebrities and so on. Now, those rituals that they're performing on the Grammy Awards are actual rituals. They are actual satanic rituals. And now, if you're somebody who simply participates in or watches that kind of content on a regular basis, that may be one factor that's contributing to the frequency and what you're attracting into your life. On the other hand, if you're somebody who surrounds yourself with beautiful things and you're happy and you've got good relationships in your life that also are very positive, and you watch inspiring things on TV or movies, and you aren't really drawn to the negative, dark things, then that's also going to help make things easier or harder for you in terms of maintaining a higher vibration. It may not be what brings about that vibration, but certainly there are supportive factors that are going to either make it easier or harder. And I think this is why some people may have an easier time maintaining that higher frequency, where others may have a harder time and may continually attract lower vibrational beings. Nowadays, because of Hollywood and other kinds of influences, it's very easy to be drawn into that lower vibrational existence, just simply watching shows. I mean, in the last decade alone, so many people have been attracted to very scary, very violent, or even, zombie kind of apocalypse films. And so it's no accident we find ourselves in a world where so many people are in fear these days. So what you introduce into your physical environment, your mind, all of those are factors in maintaining a higher vibration. Even simple things like essential oils that you use can assist you in maintaining a higher vibration. I don't think by themselves they can produce that, but certainly these are all things you can do to help support an environment where you can bring about those higher frequencies of existence. And of course, the people you spend your time with are also a factor. If you're generally around people who inspire you, and you read things that make you happy, you watch things that make you happy, you're going to have an easier time maintaining a higher state of frequency until you get to a point where that higher state of being, frequency, consciousness is so ingrained in you that it would be very hard to offset it. And at that point, you can expose yourself to those kind of things. Like when I'm doing energy transfers, I can expose myself to other people sending me their density or their attachments, because my physical structure and my being are so ingrained or so rooted, anchored in this higher frequency, that just because density is all around me, it doesn't really impact me, and I can actually neutralize those things. So that's where I think we should all aspire to maintain that frequency and to cultivate that in ourselves, because that's a more empowering way of being, as opposed to the idea of shielding ourselves from the environment or the world, which you can't really do because you're a part of everything. You're a part of this physical reality, and in the all the various dimensions, you're constantly interacting and sharing energy with those with all of those things. And so shielding yourself is really not a very viable or successful approach, I don't think. And certainly a lot of people who have attachments are trying to shield themselves in some way or another, and it is not working. So I don't think that's as effective.
Yeah, it's a tall order in today's world to to try to navigate everything that's happening and not allow it to quote unquote bring your vibration down. But there's a couple of points I want to make about that. What I'm coming to, this is just my personal understanding and belief and all the channeling that I've done, is that as we increase our bandwidth of consciousness, we are also going to see more things in the world that we probably do not want to see. And that can be a huge contributing factor in our vibration. And I often notice that tug of war in people who are in the spiritual movement, and in either they're so wrapped up in what's going on in the world that they become lost of hope, and faith is gone, right? Or they are trying so hard to protect themselves from certain energies that they're really not participating in some of these things. And I don't necessarily believe blocking what's going on in the world or not knowing the negative things is a healthy approach to raising your vibration or being in that level of consciousness. Because why would we increase our level of awareness to be able to see everything that's happening and then decide that we're not going to include some of those things in our reality? Because I believe it's all here to serve us. It's all here to help us to make improvements and to make better choices and to, change an entire lineage and generation. And I think when it comes to reptilian energies, which I think encompasses a lot, we throw this word reptilian around quite a bit, and we can become as, narrowly focused on that reptilian definition as we want. But what the guides say is that unfortunately, we've kind of been hybridized with reptilians. So they use the term reptilian consciousness quite a bit. And we see that manifesting in things like the Grammys, for example. If we did not have a reptilian consciousness present within us or on the planet, we wouldn't be seeing things like that happen anymore. So everything is a mirror reflection of the level of consciousness that humanity has reached. But I do think it's important to also remember that everything we interact with is going to leave behind like a residue or a vibrational impression upon us. And as long as we're not choosing out of fear, meaning we're blocking things out because we're afraid that they are going to weaken us in some way, I think that's a great approach. What we're attempting to do is become strengthened by the things that we know, which I think ultimately leads to the more physical, embodied part of this discussion, which, we'll get to in a moment. But I posted something on my Facebook wall, I think it was about a month ago, having to do with things like, the Orion Wars and Archons and reptilians and, the Anunnaki and the Greys and all of these things. And we can become really entangled in all of that history. And by the way, we are. That's is what we're experiencing right now. Everything that's ever been created or has ever happened anywhere in the universe will come back around, and we, as a race, will experience it through our own eyes and in our own way. And the guides have said this is a period of great timeline collision, massive timeline collision for us, and it's purposeful because we have changed as human beings, and we have to leave behind all of this old history. We aren't able to walk through it in the same way we did before, even though we're struggling with a lot of it right now. And in some respects, we are repeating timeline experiences. We're receiving all of this energy so that we can upgrade ourselves to a new reality, so that we make different decisions within it. And I think that personal physical decisions have a lot to do with entity attachments. And I'll give you just a real simplistic example. The guides say that we can have entities and dark energies all around us, but in order for them to really get into the window of our world, into our hologram, they need a story, right? So watching those zombie apocalypse movies, that's the story. So we see the story, it vibrationally affects us, but we replay the story. And on the world, or on the planet today, everything that we have created has a foundation in fear, if you think about it. Like buying insurance just in case we are in a car accident, or buying life insurance just in case, right? All those things have their foundation in fear. And so it's hard because there's a lot of subconscious fear going on that sometimes I think we don't recognize because it's become so normalized. So any story that you're playing right now that's holding on to fear, even the ones that you don't realize, are like these open wounds in your auric field for these beings to come in and actually take advantage of you. So making physical choices like what you're going to watch on TV, what you're going to put in your body, even navigating some of the difficult choices that we have to today on planet Earth, they all hold merit in how these energies affect us.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that topic a little bit further, and I talk about this a lot. I'm not saying all of you are ready for this yet, but it's something to consider, at least in principle or concept, and that is that most of you watching this show, if not all of you, probably would love to have world peace and would like to end all the wars and suffering and hunger and all those kind of things that people are suffering with around the world. A great deal of those problems, though, are problems that are being created by the world governments and world leaders. These are not problems that would exist if we didn't have the global system of governance that we currently have, which in more recent decades has become more and more corrupt and more, moving toward a reptilian consciousness direction, although it's been that way for a long time. And so, but meanwhile, while we would not approve of those things, and we would love to have a world where there's peace, the majority of people simply go to the voting booth to vote for the next president or leader. And most of the leaders actually today who rule the world are not even voted in. They're just people who self-appointed into these roles of power who are controlling the world. And nowadays, we really do have a one world government that's ruled over by a handful of people who are not voted by anybody. Not that voting even matters nowadays, but it's gone so far to where voting and the idea of voting is a complete illusion, and even most people can see that now. So, but meanwhile, not me, but most people pay their taxes because they feel like this is something they need to do. But understand that when you take that physical action to pay taxes to a government or a banking system, who are the ones who are taking your money and who are fighting wars and who are causing suffering and who are causing all manner of hardship to people all over the world, those things are being done in your name. You are enabling those things. So it's not enough for us to meditate and visualize a happier, better world, or to donate some of our time or money to a charity that hopefully is going to do something good in the world, we have to understand that if we are doing things that we think are good, whether they be, for example, we may have a vision board or hold certain positive intentions. Meanwhile, we're taking all the physical actions that are contradicting those things. We can't expect to see a better world. So it's not enough. And I think this is one of the biggest issues I see in the spiritual community, is that the majority of people don't want to live in the physical dimension, or at least live as if they don't live in a physical dimension. We walk this world and we're doing all the things in other dimensions, and we're working on our spiritual bodies. Meanwhile, we're walking in a physical world and doing all the things that cause suffering and hardship, and expecting that simply because we are using spiritual practices that the world is going to be a better place and our lives will be. That doesn't really work that way. We came here into a physical reality in order to make physical choices to alter our experience here one way or another. So if you are paying somebody who's going to take your money and cause suffering and hardship, not only for other people in other countries that have to deal with wars and suffering, but also causing you suffering. Because I think in the United States, as an example, and I think this is true worldwide, but since I'm here, I can speak more directly to this area, being very familiar with it. The taxes that you're paying in the United States are being used to cause your own suffering. They're enslaving you. So you're basically paying your slave owner to enslave you. And meanwhile, if all we're doing is meditating and visualizing a better world, but we're paying the slave owner to cause suffering for us, you can't expect your life or the world to become better. So essentially what I'm saying is that we have to make physical choices that are in alignment with our spiritual principles and our spiritual practices in order to see the result in our physical lives, because we did come here to have this physical human experience. Otherwise, we wouldn't have come here. We would have just stayed in some multidimensional reality and would have done whatever we would do in that reality. But in a physical dimension, you have a physical body and you're living in and touching physical things. You have to make choices that are congruent with that. Like, for example, last few years, all the vaccine things that were going on. And this is also, there's so many spiritual teachers in the last few years who we started to realize who they really were. So, many of them who had been professing for their entire careers about how mind over body was the path to good health. So if you held good thoughts and believed that you were healthy, you were going to be. And then the last few years, they were very strong supporters of vaccination. But the two ideas don't coexist. You cannot live in a reality where mind and body mind influences the body, and then make different physical choices with the fear that, well, if I don't take this vaccine, then I'm going to have an unhealthy body. So essentially what I'm saying is our physical choices are important as much, or if not more so, than the spiritual choices and beliefs that we hold. Both have to be brought into alignment with each other in order to live a better life while you're in a physical body. When you leave this place, you don't have to worry about those things. But while you're here, both have to be considered.
Yeah, I agree with that. The vibrational contradiction between what we believe and how we live that belief is the gap that these negative entities look for. Or, it just in general weakens us and supports a hierarchical structure that has been here on planet Earth for a very long time, that we're on the trajectory of totally dismantling right now. And so for a long time, and this is coming from the book that I channeled, for a long time, as humans, we have been really focused on the more spiritual part of our human experience. Not all of us, but a great many of us have been exploring these concepts of, law of attraction, for example, which we've talked about before. And that was purposeful because we were awakening to things that we had never considered before. And because of that, everything in our world had to change. And it's hard to see a connection between spiritual awakening and the amount of restrictions that have been physically placed on the population over the last couple of years, but they do actually go hand in hand. Because what we are receiving an opportunity to prove to ourselves is that there really are no consequences. And the amount of freedom that we thought we had was extremely limited as compared to the truth of who we are, our true sovereignty. And so it's a difficult period of spiritual embodiment. It's like kind of shifting from that more spiritual viewpoint and then having the opportunity to actually apply it and put it into action on a physical planet, because the material manifestations of what is coming next, we are all responsible for. We're the ones who are building that future with our own hands, with our brains, with our ideas, with our contributions. So if we don't believe in something and we know it's bad, but we do it for fear of consequence, then absolutely we're kind of going back in time and we're staying in that realm where we are more vulnerable to these various attacks and more hierarchical influence like what we've had before. And even how we're addressing a lot of these kind of historic events that are coming back around, like war and inequality, right? And all of these things. The reason they come back around is because we're meeting them with the same vibration. And the goal is not to continue in that realm. It's to actually raise the vibration and the potential to something new. So the guides say we've been in this really stagnant vibration as a collective for an extremely long time. And that's why we're replaying the same stories over and over again. And those stories they're stories of suffering, whether they're physical disease or, we have to work a certain number of hours for someone to make a living, to buy a house, to do all these things. Those are the stories we are right now rewriting. And it takes a little risk to be willing to actually step into a new story. But that's what this period on Earth, I believe, is truly all about. And that takes care of all the other stuff. So we hear a lot through, channels and, in this community about, the Pleiadians are out there fighting the good fight for us. Ships are taking down the Reptilians and bringing, certain entities to justice. And I don't doubt that those things happen. At the same time, my experience is that higher vibrational or dimensional beings would never involve themselves in war, even if it was to save an entire human race. And this is why. They know that act will perpetuate throughout history, and it's going to come back around and we'd have to repeat it again. So what they do is they attempt to give us courage and strength, to awaken us to things that we don't know so that we can do it ourselves. They're trying to show us how much confidence they have in us to make these really hard choices and to walk the paths less traveled because they've done it themselves. So the highest vibrational and dimensional beings would never involve themselves in our stories other than to lift us up enough to rewrite them.
It's extraordinarily inconvenient to live in such a way that your physical actions and decisions are in alignment with higher spiritual principles in the world that we live in today. And that's because society has been set up, it's been structured in a way such as to make doing all the wrong things very convenient. So if you want to suffer and have a difficult life, society is set up for that. It's very convenient to do those things. And for example, even the music that's played has been changed in frequency so that it causes more suffering for people. So it takes, or even the shows these days, movies and television and so on, or Netflix or whatever networks you watch in your area, have all been changed in order to cause the most suffering and control of the people. So if you just are going about your life the way that everybody else is, which when your consciousness is lower, you have the luxury of doing that because you don't know. You can't see the things that you see. And many of you may have family members or go to family events and you can't really talk about these things because nobody there understands what you're saying. And I experience that with my family as well. It's as if I live in a different reality or a different world, which is true. So we're, Micheila, and oftentimes the guides talk about fifth dimensional realities and so on. And this is how it sort of manifests, in that you can have two people sitting in the same physical room, but they're actually in two different realities. They perceive the reality of the room that they're in entirely different ways. And this is what happens when your consciousness grows. You may still be walking in the same shoes, in the same world as somebody else, but you see things and you know things that you can't unknow anymore. And that comes with a certain amount of responsibility. And it also comes with the situation where you have to make choices that are inconvenient for you, meaning you may have to live in such a way that it's not as easy to live in modern society, because the things that have been made easy in modern society are the things that are causing the most hardship for people. And so if you want to live in such a way that you are living a happy, more positive life and in a higher state of being, you may have to make choices that are outside the realm of what is convenient or what is normal or what is accepted by your peers or family members. But that's what happens. So just be aware that the decision to change in consciousness or the move to a higher consciousness may make you even more aware of all the suffering. We were just talking before we got out on this podcast that that when your consciousness grows, you start to see more of what's happening in the world, and it can cause more hardship at first, or at least difficulty to accept these things, because now you can see all of the things and the moving parts, and the more conscious you become, the more things you see that are not the right kinds of choices that people are making or the direction that the world is going. And you could hide your head in the sand if you wanted to, but that's just a consequence of consciousness. And at that point, knowing those things, you have to make inconvenient choices in order to live in such a way that you're living outside of that. Now, like one thing might be, for example, when you're of a lower consciousness, you may not know or even understand that in eating genetically modified foods is going to be bad for your health and may even alter your genetics and may even alter your consciousness. But when you're of that consciousness, you don't realize that there is anything wrong with that. So you can go on living your life and be blissfully ignorant of those things. But when suddenly your consciousness grows and you come to the awareness that genetically modified foods or fluoride in the water or chemicals that are being sprayed in the sky, even to this day, most people don't realize that that's going on. Most people still think there are contrails, where nowadays there's almost no actual airplane contrails anymore. It's almost always chemtrails these days. But the majority of people don't even know that. And we've known this for a long time. And that is the price of consciousness, is you become aware of things that most people don't even know. And once you know, you have to make different choices. And those choices may not be convenient. Maybe that means that, well, you can't eat certain foods, or you go to family events and where everything is genetically modified. Well, you just may not be able to eat those things. And you can't simply spiritualize those things away and say, well, I'm going to eat these genetically modified foods and it's okay because I'm going to will them to not be genetically modified. So I'm just going to intend that they're healthy and eat them anyway. You can see how those thoughts are incongruent. On the one hand, physically they're genetically modified foods, and spiritually you're saying I'm just going to bless them, and I'm not saying blessing doesn't do anything, but you can't have two opposing ideas or two opposing actions and expect that it's going to produce a good result, because you're still working against the physical dimension. Right now, if I were to pound my hand on this table, it would probably hurt, and I'd feel the physical pain in my hand. Now, sure, there are some practices that I could take on that would cause my hand to not feel physical pain, and that's certainly true. But there are certain physical things that most people deal with that are just a product of living in a physical world. And so we have to make sure that the physical choices and actions we make are congruent with our spiritual values and our consciousness at that time. So that may mean that, well, I don't really get to go to restaurants as much as I might have done earlier in life when I didn't know what I know now. Or other choices like that. I may have to filter the fluoride out of my water because now I know that that is not a positive thing for my consciousness, for my spiritual growth, and also my health. And these are inconvenient decisions. It's much easier just to turn on the faucet and drink whatever comes out of the faucet. And for most people who don't have that awareness yet, that's a perfectly okay decision. But understand, as your consciousness grows and you start becoming aware of these things, you have to now change how you live and how you choose to interact with your physical universe. You can't just pretend like those awarenesses no longer are not existing right now, because that's just one of the privileges and consequences of an expansion of consciousness. And we have to live in such a way where those things are congruent with our spiritual values and beliefs.
And that can be a real bummer at first. But I think a tool that's really handy that the guides talk about a lot is perspective. So as we raise consciousness and we become more multidimensional, we have this ability to play with perspective. And one of the examples I'll bring up, even though it doesn't really apply directly to the topic we're talking about, but it's a question I get a lot, is trauma. I think all of us here, have had some kind of childhood trauma at varying levels, or even in adulthood, we've experienced some really terrible things. And here in this timeline, all of us, unfortunately, are wound within the human condition. And what that means is we came to change it. We didn't look down and say, I'm going to take that karma because I want to suffer. We were so confident that we did not want that thread of energy to continue on in our family lineage, or we had experienced it in so many other lifetimes that we said the buck stops with me. So we have this terrible fate that we went through, and the perspective that we apply to it determines whether it remains an open wound or a weakness, or something that fuels our service. So really, from a collective standpoint, as we awaken and we become more conscious and we see all these terrible things in the world, we see GMO foods, and all of a sudden we think, well, shoot, I can't eat at a restaurant. We can either allow that to weaken us, or we can shift the perspective and turn it into a part of our service, something really positive. Because whatever we put our energy, our attention, our money into is something that we are going to grow in this reality. And so just from that basic decision to not eat GMO foods at a restaurant, as much of a bummer as it might be from a social standpoint, you are making a profound impact, not only on this timeline, but on all other timelines from a quantum perspective. And GMO food is a huge part of this reptilian consciousness. It's how it manifests. right? So everything that we see that we would rather not see is helping us to develop this internal GPS to what our service and our purpose is here in this world at this time. So again, it can either cause us to feel this kind of, sense of hopelessness, or it can inspire us to become someone different for the collective. And I think for me, that's, that what my huge takeaway is, my life has changed drastically over the last 15 years or so. And in some respects, those in my family who are not as awakened perhaps, or, on the same dimensional, plane as me, they might see that as a detriment. I'm no fun anymore because I don't drink and I don't go to restaurants and this and that. But I love my life. I consider my life sacred. I love cooking all my own food. And yeah, we definitely go out to some really nice conscious restaurants, every now and then, even though the pickings are slim. But I would never give that back. I would never turn around and go back to the old way of doing it. I couldn't. It's just no longer who I am in the world. It's a part of my service. And everything that we look at, I think, is somehow a puzzle piece to understanding why we came here now in this timeline, which I think a lot of people struggle over in today's world. I meet so many people in session, and another huge question, common question is, what is my purpose? Why am I here? All of these things are why we are here. And some of us are just working the energy differently, and there's certain talents and, creativity that we're blending together into this really unique offering. But every day and every moment, every decision that you make to navigate this reality that you're awakening to is the most powerful contribution.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you go through awakening experiences, and everybody goes through, or I should say, a lot of people I've known over the years have gone through many awakening experiences, and each time you start seeing things that you never saw before, and then you have another awakening experience, and suddenly you see things you never even saw before that. And this is just a constant process of the human journey. Enlightenment is not a destination, it's a process that you're constantly going through. So you don't reach a place called enlightenment at some point in this life if you're on a spiritual path. If you're doing it right, then you're going to constantly be reaching new states of enlightenment as you go. And until whatever time is reached where you've completed your journey here. But for a lot of people, when these awakening experiences happen, it can be a little bit scary because suddenly they find themselves in a world where nothing they knew before makes any sense anymore. And suddenly they're faced with all these choices they made earlier in life, which they now would not make or wouldn't want to make. But how do you make that transition from the way you've been living all along to something that's now congruent with an entirely new perspective? And that can be difficult, I think, for a lot of people. And so I think many people will choose to keep doing things the way they were, even though they know it's not the healthiest for them in the life they're living now. Partly because, well, you don't want to be judged, or you go to family events or around the friends you used to have, and they may not hold those new values that you now have, or see the world the way that you see it. And so it requires you to make a lot of changes. You may not have the same friends anymore. Maybe you don't talk about certain things with your family, or maybe even some family members may gravitate out of your life and may not be as important, because as you change, your surroundings and the people you surround yourself with will also change. So these are all scary things for a lot of people every time awakening happens, to have to go through that. And sometimes when awakening occurs, your whole life will completely change, where everything you held on to as your security blanket in your life is stripped away and is completely replaced by with a whole new life, whole new purpose, whole new relationships, and so on. And And these can be difficult transitions that will occur when consciousness expansion occurs. But it's really important that once you have that new awareness and new consciousness, that you live in alignment with those, with that new perspective. That may mean filtering the fluoride, or not eating GMO foods, or whatever the case may be for you, or not getting vaccinated because you know that that's not something that's healthy for you. Now, if you don't know that, then that's perfectly fine. That is just where you are in your human journey. It's not a right or wrong thing. I may even be living in such a way today that at some point in my physical incarnation, if I have another awakening, may look back and think, oh, I wouldn't do that anymore. But from where I am now and my current self-awareness and my current consciousness, I may not possess the wisdom yet to know that those things or choices that I'm making are not appropriate for my ultimate well-being. And so, and then that's what we have to do when we see family members and friends who are not able to see reality the way that we do. It's not up to us to change them. They don't need to be changed. They are simply where they are because that is their experience at this time. And no amount of you talking to them and sharing whatever facts or reality you believe in is going to change how they see reality, because they are not able to, because their consciousness doesn't support it. When their consciousness supports it, if that happens in this lifetime, they will naturally come to you asking those questions, or they will be drawn to the books and the teachers and the videos and other kinds of things that feed that new self-awareness. And it's not something that you can force on someone simply through words. It has to, all understanding of the universe has to come from within first. That soil has to be prepared. And then once it's prepared, you can plant things in it and it'll grow. But if the soil isn't ready and you're trying to plant seeds, those seeds will not germinate. They will just stay there dormant until someday, maybe in this lifetime or some other one, the soil will be ready and then those seeds will germinate. So you have to be patient with people, allow them to be where they are, but meanwhile, you may have to make inconvenient choices in order to live in alignment with who you now are.
Yeah, the guides always say living your truth is a far more powerful contribution to every soul contract that you are in than speaking it. So living it is a demonstration, an active demonstration of what those who are in relationship with you signed up to see. But I want to bring this back into context of, entities where we started this whole conversation, with the genetic wars and, the Greys and the Orion wars. We need to simplify all of these things. And we can see a connection. We can literally draw a line between this cosmic history and all of the things we've been talking about today in this podcast, whether it's the food or, vaccination. And so if we really want to quote unquote protect ourselves or become a stronger race that doesn't have to deal with these timeline experiences ever again, the only solution is for us to stand our ground in the physical, because we signed up to be physical beings. And certainly spiritual practice is hugely important because it sets the tone for us to have the courage and the energy and the propensity to make very clear decisions and to do it all very consciously. And I think that is a really important point to always remember. We can be saying no to all of these things while at the same time beating the drum of their vibration, speaking out against them. And there are people, don't get me wrong, who are here, souls that are here with very important missions to awaken the public about certain things. But I think sometimes we all get a little entangled in that ourselves. And when we do, we miss out on why we are here and what our important service is to humanity, which again can be very simplified first in the foundation of our own lives, because that is not only the greatest contribution, but it sets us up to be able to serve in a greater way. Because if our life isn't stable and we aren't making the right choices for ourselves, we won't have the resilient health or the abundance and the prosperity, to share wider on a larger basis. So I think that that's ultimately what reptilian consciousness and a lot of these negative entities and beings and their intent is all about. We talk a lot about siphoning our energy. Well, what is that taking us away from? It's taking us away from the really important things that we came to do, and really the profound present moment attention that we can place in our lives that makes the biggest impact. So whether we're looking at the World Economic Forum or someone like Bill Gates, for example, or a myriad of others that we could point out, we are truly seeing the physical manifestation of this cosmic history in real time. And the second that we accept that, it all becomes easy. We navigate around it, and it really can no longer cease to exist. So in conclusion, I think simplifying a very complex situation is what is necessary here. And in doing that, we not only find peace within ourselves, but that peace extends outward to the entire world.
Thank you all for joining us again for our podcast, and we will see you again next week.